Hello and welcome on in, everybody. Great to see you. My name is Sam Peterson. I am your host for today's Photoshop challenge, where we're going to be removing a figure from a scene. Hope everyone's doing good. Hope everyone had a good weekend. If you want to join in on this challenge, make sure to download the starter file down below in the description. You can follow along with exactly what I'm doing, or you can use your own image and kind of take this challenge and run with it, depending on your level of comfort and how advanced you feel that you are. If you want to just kind of follow along and make it easy, or just kind of do whatever sounds fun to you. So let me jump into Photoshop here and show you what we're working with. So this is the image that I'm using. This is what you'll find in the starter file, and this is kind of what we're creating. So we're removing a figure from a scene, but with some added complexities of an object being interacted with, another figure being interacted with, and now if we want to remove this figure from the scene, on the right hand side, this is probably the easiest figure because he's just got a background behind him. This guy on the left is a little bit more complex because he's kind of overlapping with another person. But we're going to do this guy in the middle who's overlapping a person and an object, and we'll kind of start off with the more simple aspects of this technique, and we'll get into like a little bit more of the advanced things and how you can really kind of modify and make up areas of the scene that aren't really visible. So let's jump into it. And what I'm going to do is select my background image and grab my object selection tool. So I have the magic wand right here, but I can click and hold to select my object. To make sure that object finder is checked here in the top left. And when I hover over people, it automatically kind of identifies different objects in the scene. It's grabbing this guy as well. So I'm just going to click him. And then I don't want to mask just him out. I don't want to remove the background. I want to remove him. So I'm going to do Controller Command Shift I to invert the selection. And then I'm going to hit this little mask button at the bottom of the layers panel, that little rectangle, and we're going to mask him out that way. So from here, what I want to do is I want to grab my selection. I want to grab the shape of him. So I can actually click on the mask with Controller Command and click, and it's going to grab that little area. Now it actually has the rest of it selected, so I want to invert that again. Controller Command Shift I to invert, and now we have this little shape here. I want to use Content Aware Fill here, but I want to give it a little bit more room. You can see there's some space there where it didn't catch the very edge. So I want to expand that selection by going to Select, Modify, Expand. And I'm going to go with I think we can try 7 pixels. I think that's going to be good. Just enough to kind of reach outside there. It didn't quite get that part of the head, but that's okay. Looks pretty good to me. So now that we have that selection, I can create a new layer. And you can either do that by layer, new layer, or I do Shift Control N for a hotkey, and that makes it a bit faster. From here, I want to go to Edit, and I want to go to Content Aware Fill right here. Now it automatically selects a portion of the background. I'm going to zoom out, and I'm going to just negate this entire selection that you can see that is in green. I'm going to make a very specific part of this image selected. So I don't want to select the red cloth, but to the left and right of his body is going to be the most accurate part of the background for it to essentially fill in and duplicate. So I want to sample that. And I'm filling this in. You can see how it highlights it in green. You can also click on the little negative up here to subtract from it if you went too far. But what's really great is you can see this preview over on the right-hand side that's kind of showing what this looks like so far. So when I select more area, you'll watch it update. And you can use that to your advantage by just selecting areas, seeing if it made it better or worse, and then going from there. So I'm going to make my size a bit smaller so I can get some of these areas right above the cloth. I don't want to select the cloth. Just to fill in the hand. And you'll see it still has some water inside the hand, so I might want to try selecting more sky, less water, see how that goes. So I might take this minus, cut down on the water. You can see it updates it a bit, and I think that looks pretty decent. I can see how that affects the water, so I might just play around with this. Kind of Control Z. I'm looking at that preview, and I think this is good enough. So I'm going to click OK. You can play around with that as long as you want, but for the sake of time, I think this is a pretty good job right there. Now we're going to need to clean this up a little bit. So what I want to do is I actually didn't have anything output on this layer, output it to a new layer. So I'll delete that. And then this layer I'll do fill. I'll just call it fill, just so I know that's our content aware fill initially. And from here, what I want to do is create a new layer. I'm doing the hotkey Controller Command Shift N, and then I can type in the name. I'll just call this clone, because this is going to be our clone stamp. And then we are ready to kind of clean up this background area. I also just wanted to say hey to everyone. It's good to see you all. Thanks for hanging out today. Thanks for showing up. We got RB and Steve, Marsha, Annika, Sean. Hey, Sean. Sean says, would you break it down into steps? Water, apply, sky, apply, etc. Are you talking about for the content aware fill? Yeah, you could definitely put it out to different layers if that gets you better results. I think that's good to experiment with. Sometimes if you're doing really complex images, it is good to break it down in different layers. We are actually going to be doing that with some of the techniques later. But yeah, if it's too much, if content aware fill is trying to fill in like the sky and the water and the sand and all these textures and it's confusing it a little bit, I'd recommend trying it on different layers. Good to see you, Oliver, Judith. Welcome on in, everybody. Damien, welcome on in. All right, so the next part I want to jump into is just cleaning up the background. I'm going to grab the stamp, the clone stamp tool here, hotkey S. And what we can do here is you can use the bracket keys to move the size up and down. And you can use Alt or Option to grab from the background. So I can select right on the seam of the water, click, holding Alt, and then I can fill that in. So I could fill it in here, and you can try to redo that. You can see kind of a preview of where it's putting it down. So I want to line that water up. Now, one thing that happened here is we got a little bit of the figure. And this is why I like doing things on different layers, because now I can take my eraser tool and just remove the part of the figure. So if you ever have an area that, you know, it's you want part of it, but not quite, you can always just use a separate layer. I'm going to select this water. We have part of this foot kind of not looking quite right. So I want to get that water and that reflection on the sand. I just want to sort of replace that there. And this is using a soft brush, so the seam between them is very, very hard to notice. It's seamless is the goal. So from here, I think that actually looks okay. We could always try doing it with part of the sky if you think that looks a little rough. Can erase that out. I got the hard edge there that I don't want. But I think for now that's okay for our purposes. There's also the spot healing brush tool, and I use this a lot too, but I don't actually really need it too much. But I am noticing here in the water, there's some of these hard edges. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a seam there that I don't like too much. So I'm actually going to make a new layer with Controller Command Shift N, and we'll call this healing. You don't need to do these on separate layers, but I like the control that gives. All right, so I'm just going to kind of run this over it a few times. You can also try it in the same direction as the texture, but since our seams are kind of vertical, let's see. There we go. I had a little bit of lag there. I think that's looking okay. We could also take our clone stamp. I feel like I'm losing some texture there. So I just want to get a little bit of a stamp here and there, and I can erase the edges again if I see some hard edges. So the clone stamp and the spot healing brush tool can just be kind of used depending on where you need each one. There we go. So I think that looks okay. A little bit of cleanup there. All right, so from here, what I want to do is clean up this cloth a bit, because this is going to be the more advanced part. So when we get into removing figures in this way, that's a lot easier because it's essentially content-aware fill and then clone stamp to sort of fill in the background or whatever we're missing with, the same textures that we're seeing in the rest of the scene. We're referencing the rest of the scene. Now, repairing an image like this is going to be the more advanced technique. So if you're just learning the basics, feel free to just remove a figure from a background and use some of those clone stamp techniques and content-aware fill. But I'm going to show you some techniques I use for a bit more tricky images like this one. What's up, Ted? Good to see you. Does sample all layers need to be checked? Thank you for saying that. I meant to mention that, yes. Make sure that you're seeing sample all layers. We got the pro tip from Ted in the chat. That's very important. Otherwise, it's going to be trying to sample from a blank layer. So definitely make sure that is on. And I believe that's the same with the spot healing brush tool. You'll see that there's a little checkbox at the top that says sample all layers. You want to make sure that is checked on as well. So up next, let's get into selecting this figure again. So I'm going to control or command click the mask in our original layer, and that'll select that. And once again, I'm going to do control or command shift I to invert that selection, and I'm going to expand that selection. Now, originally we expanded the selection 7 pixels, I believe. So we'll go to select, modify, expand. But this time, I want to do 8 pixels because I want to go just beyond that a little bit. I think that should work. I don't want to cover too much of the original image. So what we'll do here is actually select our lasso tool. And what I want to do is just have the parts of the cloth that are missing and sort of guess what the cloth would be underneath it. So I'm going to connect these shapes. I'm using the lasso tool here up at the top left-hand corner, and I'm holding an Alt Option to deselect from this. So what I'm doing is trying to imagine what the shape behind it would be based off just what's missing. You can kind of make this up, you could do kind of these swirly lines. But I'm just going to try to connect them in the way that I think they might. Whoops. Control Z, get that back. And again, I'm holding on Alt Option to deselect. Now you could do these selections with pen tools. I'm pretty comfortable with the lasso tool. If you're using a mouse, you might find it a bit more difficult. There's plenty of selection tools in Photoshop, so if you're comfortable with one over the other, feel free to use that. Pen tool is often one that gives you a lot of precision. So I'm just going to deselect everything else here. By the way, I'm rotating my canvas with R, and you can always press escape to snap it back. So this looks pretty good. I think that is what I want, so I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to do content aware fill. And then from here, what I want to do is the same thing we did before, which is to negate the selection because I want to specifically only select parts of this cloth. So I'm going to make the cloth or the brush a lot smaller. I'm going to zoom in, and I'm essentially just going to select as much of the cloth as I can, and we'll kind of see how it updates down below. So again, you can use that to see if you want to make that selection. So as I add it to this selection, I can kind of see, did it get better or worse? So what I'm going to do is try to fill it in all first, and then when I'm kind of fine-tuning that selection, I might change it depending on what it looks like. We definitely want this little part. It's kind of where the fabric is bunched up and dense. So that looks not too bad. We could see what happens when we select part of this arm. Does that make it better or worse? It's kind of giving me some weird textures on the right side. notice much there. So I think this might be pretty good. So I'm going to select OK, and it's filled in for us there. Now we have that on a new layer. Now, before we go into this and clean up the cloth, and I'll call this cloth fill. I do like naming my layers, especially when we gotta get a lot of layers going. This layer one keeps outputting it to a new layer, so I don't need to make that. I can delete that. And that looks pretty good. One thing I see here is there's still some of this figure showing, right? We see it in the sky. It's not looking too good. Well, we could try using the clone stamp on that like we did, or even the spot healing tool. But sometimes when it's something like this, I actually just like the control that a paintbrush gives me. So I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm just going to type BG for background paint. So we keep these layers organized. I'm going to rotate my canvas by holding R. And what I want to do is actually just select kind of the same thing we did before. Now, maybe this is kind of my background as an illustrator and as a painter, but sometimes I find it is actually easy in certain circumstances to just sort of paint in areas of the background. And you'll see how we'll do that in a second. This one's actually pretty simple since it's just a gradient. But we can do this pretty easily with a soft brush, and it's going to kind of blend together the colors of the background. So I kind of have all those areas that have a little bit of these weird hard edges. I might just make this bigger here. All right, and now we have our background layer, or our background paint layer. We got a new layer for this. I'm going to select a soft brush, just the default soft brush. And if you're using a mouse, what you probably want to do is turn the flow down. We can turn it down to like 20, 30. And what you can do is use Alt or Option to select areas of the background. Now I want to select this little light area because that's where the original was. This darker area was content aware fill guessing, but we can see that it's incorrect since the actual color was this bright yellow. So I'm just going to kind of click a few times. Now I can turn my flow up. I won't have to click as many times, but this gives you a slow buildup. And you can just sample around with Alt or Option, color pick, and then kind of blend those areas together. This is essentially how digital painting works. But you can click there. Now, one thing I do want to be careful of is, since I have a selection here, I probably want this up against the cloth. Otherwise, we could get a hard edge because of the lasso tool selection. But I'm just going to do a few of these. I'm kind of clicking, sampling, clicking again, just trying to blend these two tones together in a more natural way. You can do that up here too. This one's pretty subtle, so I think it already looks pretty good. Press Control or Command D to deselect and kind of see, does that look good? I think it looks pretty good. So just some airbrushing there. If it's a gradient, that's the easiest place to do it. If you have something that's heavy textured like this, I would definitely recommend using the clone stamp and utilizing the texture that's already there, because it's hard to replicate that with brushes. But airbrushing, on soft gradients is usually a good way to go. So now the last thing, make sure we got some time for this, is to clean up this cloth. This is definitely the most difficult part, and this is kind of where we're going to be getting into some like making it up, painting it, but I'll show you a few different techniques that we can use here. So what I want to do is I want to create a new layer that we can call like cloth clone, just so we know that this is like clone stamp for the cloth. Now I'm going to select my clone stamp tool again. And what we can do is we can try to grab some of these. Like this area here looks like it would be pretty similar. We can just try to copy it there. Now I like the center, right? I like how it continues, but it erased some of the background. So since I have this on its own layer, I can actually go to an eraser and just sort of airbrush that edge. And now this is going to be this is sort of like a manual painting technique. So it doesn't look perfect, but it looks a little bit better now. We could also try this. I'm going to make a new layer again. And I'm going to start merging these layers at some point, but when I'm doing this technique, sometimes I like to kind of put it on its own layer because it gives me a bit more flexibility. Let's make that smaller. What I could kind of do here even is go to Edit, Transform, Warp, which I have hotkeyed. So Edit, Transform, Warp, and you could even do a warp on one layer or a clone stamp on one layer and then warp it into place. So we can kind of continue that shape. You see that? So we still have a sort of that same texture, but we can kind of warp it into that shape that we can tell it was already forming. If I need to, I can soften the edge. I'm erasing the edge a bit. So you can see these are like more manual painting techniques a little bit. This is kind of blending between like, you know, photo editing, compositing, and painting. Yeah, you can also rotate the clone stamp. Let's see. So from here, I may want to do this on a new layer, and I might just make a new layer every time I do this technique. And then I can clean it up, you know, airbrush out the parts I don't like, blend them together a little bit. I mean, these techniques admittedly take a long time. You can spend tons of time retouching images like this and fine-tuning them. But I just want to show you a little bit of everything. So I'm going to move on to the next technique in just a moment. But like that looks pretty good. I might airbrush out this area right here. So what I want to do, what I was going to show you is you could even use, we'll make a new layer for this, and I would probably go back and name these layers after. But one thing that I actually do sometimes, and this really depends on your comfort with the technique, but I'll use an opaque brush or an actual brush and just paint it. Now, one thing that's very important to do is to keep in mind how soft the edges of this are, and that's going to depend on the photo. So these are actually fairly soft edges. So if you use like a lasso tool, for example, and you have an edge that's too hard, it might look out of place, but this is getting pixelated. So it's actually kind of hard to get a razor sharp edge. But sometimes people don't match the edges to the rest of the scene, which can create a bit of an artificial look. So here I'm just painting in those edges, and that kind of gives it a bit more of that look, like the fabric is bunched up right on the edge. But this is what I do when I have to fine tune, when I'm finishing it up at the very end. I tend to use the other techniques as much as I can. So what I'll do, create yet another clone stamp, and I might grab an area like this. I kind of like this area. Now, sometimes you'll find one area of the texture and you're like, oh, I could probably use that down here. So I might grab this, do something like that. And what I could do, let's see, I'll erase this edge so we get our original edge back. Now that actually looks pretty good to me. It kind of looks like it's folding over again, but you could even take this if you wanted and warp it down to follow that edge to kind of make it look a bit more like that. And then erase the edge a little bit, right? So that kind of looks right to me too, but that doesn't look bad to me either. Now, the point is we're making this up. I would highly recommend referencing your original image to see what's going to help. But from here, since we only have a little bit of time, these are essentially the techniques that I think you can play with. You can use the clone stamp and warp it, adjust it, manipulate it with all the transform tools that you need. But from here, what did I do on this original? Yeah, I just kind of faded these together. So what I might do in the end to finish it off is just clone stamp some areas here. See if I can find some textures I like. Oh, you know what? Actually, no, we got to do one more thing. We got to get this arm in place. So for the last thing we'll do, I can kind of guess what's going on with her arm here. I can sort of grab this area, and I'm sort of guessing the shape of this arm, but I could always fill that in, sample the color there, made the selection and just fill it in. Now, like I said, that edge looks a little unnaturally hard to me, so we could always try blur, blur it a couple pixels. 5 is too many. 2 actually looks pretty good. And I could even lock the transparencies, which is essentially like a clipping mask. Grab that that light color that we see, this sort of rim light, and just sort of softly fade that in. So these are just some techniques. We are out of time. Obviously, kind of creating things from nothing when you don't have the image is more difficult. But these are some techniques that you can play with if you ever encounter a scene where it's like, I have to remove this from the scene, but I need to sort of make it up. Have fun, play with some of those techniques. And really, for removing figures on their own, content-aware fill and clone stamp goes a long way. So hopefully this gave you guys some tools to work with. Check out the Discord if you're not part of it. I will be mentoring and giving feedback all this week and next for these challenges. I'd love to see what you guys come up with. And of course, if you have any questions or difficulties, definitely let me know. I'll help any way I can. Thanks so much for hanging out, everyone. It was great to see you, and I'll see y'all next time.